Good morning, everyone. As we continue to get prepared with our hybrid meeting here, I'll just remind folks that if there's background conversations, folks are going to hear you, but they should be able to see you. We've got some upcoming events you're going to see in our slides. Some of these were emailed to you. Dr. Erica will email us a little bit about what the Sikh Day, Peace Day of Prayer is all about, but there's some suicide prevention workshops coming up and some of our own events that we'll talk a little bit more about in the future, including the retreat, the annual meeting, and our big community fundraising dinner on November 6th. The Interfaith calendar that came on your agenda had a Rosh Hashanah was listed in October. It's not, it's in September. Interfaith calendar, which is usually so reliable, wasn't reliable this time. But let's get started with an opening faith reflection, which is a video that our moderator Dave Longhurst found for us.
What does it mean to be a cosmic being? A creature of divine light and welcoming darkness. An integral part of a universe that is rife with mystery and potential. This powerful embodiment cannot be constrained by social categories of racism, xenophobia, or sexual and gender bias. As we continue the struggle for justice, the universe invites us toward expanded options. We can incorporate the wonder of science in our liturgy, our prayers, and our politics. We are whole. We are connected. And we are responsible to and for one another and our host planet. We can respect the differences of light and dark as alternating and equal powers in the universe. And in the words of Ava DuVernay, quote, we can become our ancestors' wildest dreams.
Amen. So we welcome you to the September 8th elected council meeting, 109 congregations coming together to be able to do our work together. And Dave Longhurst, take it away.
Welcome everyone to this hybrid meeting. The second one we've had since the official end of COVID. There are about 10 of us here at Hillcrest Church, and we welcome all those who are online as well. First item of business is the approval of minutes from our August meeting. And would someone make a motion for approval? I can't see faces. Motion to approve and a second. Any opposed? Please.
Leonard and Diane.
Oh, Leonard and Diane. Any opposed? Please send a text message or chat message or
raise your hand.
Or raise your hand. I can't see anybody. So all right, let's moving on.
Okay. Here's the land acknowledgement. This month we're going to hear a little bit about the Zulu people. As we acknowledge the lands upon which we work, serve, and play, let us remember the first inhabitants of these lands, and as we can learn about other indigenous peoples around the world, including the Zulu tribe, where their common greeting is Sawubona. It literally means, I see you, you are important to me, and I value you. It's a way to make the other person visible and to accept them as they are, with their virtues, nuances, and flaws. In response to this greeting, people usually say with Shiboka, which means I exist for you. So when someone from the Zulu community commits an inappropriate or offensive act, their presence is required in the center of the village. Their neighbors, friends, and family make a circle around them. And for 2 days, they go to the person and greet them by saying, Sapuban. They start reminding them of their good deeds, virtues, and successes and great qualities. For the Zulu community, no person is born evil. Sometimes crises and imbalances make us stray away from our natural goodness. The purpose of these meetings in the center of the village is to remind the person that they are actually a good person at heart. In turn, they also show them how important they are to the rest of the community. The purpose is to praise them and give them visibility so they can return to the path of harmony and joy. The Zulu people believe that human beings exist only if others see and accept them. The community makes the person. Therefore, nothing is more satisfying than being forgiven after a mistake. Feeling loved and accepted is something we all crave. Let's learn from these African siblings. We need to learn to see others as they are and to pay attention to those around us. As the Sawubona greeting goes, I see you, I accept you as you are. Thinking this way will allow us to see each other's needs, forgive mistakes, and promote cohesion in our communities. We're going to have our covenant next.
Leonard Doran from B'nai Tikva will read our covenant.
Good morning. Our dialogue is an interfaith dialogue. We all have different communication styles and varying views. We commit to be in dialogue with respect for all, expanding, listening to hear multiple points of view. We realize that we are responsible for the growth of I4C, and each of us shares the duty to interfaith growth. The governing board provides leadership, and the elected council works towards progress and the fulfillment of 14C goal as we grow. We recognize that we are imbued with interfaith responsibility. As such, we commit to hold ourselves and each other accountable to merit that trust, respect for the diverse traditions, beliefs, and spiritual paths of all those we encounter, hold ourselves to the highest ethical standards, and accountable to our committees and to I4C. Our shared time together is interfaith time. We commit to honoring the start and end times each time we meet.
Thank you very much, Leonard. Let's move on now to the just some upcoming announcements, upcoming events. We have our book club Meaningful Mondays coming up on September 12th. Hope many of you can join in that discussion. There's an International Day of Peace. It's coming up on September 21st. Father Tom Bonacci will lead us the Nurturing the Beloved Community leader discussion there on October 2nd. We should be a very nice in-person gathering. The annual meeting, the Interfaith Council annual meeting is Sunday, October 23rd. It'll be a potluck dinner at the San Ramon Valley United Methodist Church. We'll have a guest speaker, Dr. Charles Tinsley, so it should be a wonderful event for us to gather in person and celebrate all the history of the Interfaith Council. And then we have our big fundraising dinner, which was originally scheduled for October 28th, and now it's rescheduled for November 6th. It will be from 3 to 5:30 at the Mount Diablo Universalist Church. I guess this is the time I can introduce Diane, who's leading this effort. I'll let her talk a little bit more about this.
We have such a wonderful guest. I'll make this short today, but The information is in your agenda, and we will be sending out a sample letter you can send to your friends, and an email with information that we would like you to support us in auction items, and perhaps guests, make sure we have guests with us, maybe a table for your group. So more will come out. You will get that in an email this week. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. That's going to be a great event. We really encourage you to support it and extend invitations to all your friends and fellow members of your faith communities. Let's see if we get some more details. We also have a matching gifts campaign underway. We have an anonymous $20,000 gift. It's wonderful to receive such great support, and your congregation can, your gift, individual gift and congregational gift can be matched from the $20,000. Yeah, please.
These. The Ahmadiyya community is doing something this Sunday from 11 to 12:30, especially talking about stopping World War III, since we're really becoming closer to the threat of nuclear war with all of the threats going on with the war in Russia and elsewhere. NAMI, our partner in mental health, is doing a special faith net on, this is the second annual Suicide Prevention Awareness Month event, and it's in Antioch in Contra Loma Park near the Lagoon area. It's free. You just let them know at the booth that you're there for the NAMI CC event, and they'll cover your entry fee. And it's a great place to walk around, and it should be 45 to 60 minutes. I did it last year, and they're looking for more faith leaders to be there to be able to speak about how their faith tradition addresses suicide prevention. Dr. Erica is going to put something in the chat for us on the UN and Sikh World Peace Day prayer, which is September 18th. The Presbytery of San Francisco, which is my local presbytery, is putting on some suicide prevention workshops that they've invited the whole broader community to. They're low cost if you want to attend for free. For 1.5 to 2 hours on a Thursday night is free, but if you want to do the full day leadership track, it's $50, and that information was in your email as well.
Thank you, Reverend Will. We now have a guest presenter. We're just thrilled that Reverend Sandhya Jha is here with us today to share some of her thoughts. She's presented before to our group, and we've just really appreciated all that she's offered to us and the learning we can receive from her. So without further ado, we now have the next hour, a little more than an hour, for Sandra and her training.
I think we've got you all set up.
Great, thank you.
And let me just get this in presentation mode. I think you just need to use the right-hand button.
Perfect, thank you. So friends, it's such a gift to be with all of you. Oh, if that'll help people hear me, absolutely. It's such a gift to be with you. I have been thinking a lot about this theme, partly because the last time I got the chance to do a workshop with I4C, I was really struck by how alive the younger people were about some of the stuff in my last presentation that I thought was a little bit on the front edge, right? That I thought was pushing the group a little, because you all are equipped to do really heavy lifting, but I thought I was pushing really hard, and the younger folks in the group were like, more of this. And I thought, I4C is really committed to not just multi-faith, but multi-generational, multi-racial work. And I wondered if it would be helpful for us.
Sure, that's all there.
Sure, thank you. I wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to think about the ways the conversation about racial justice is shifting so that we can have the conversations we need across generations. Where I want to start, though, is a really simple place. And what I'd like to ask you to do just for the next 5 minutes is find a partner, and I'm going to need your help doing breakout rooms. Find a partner and simply share what your faith says about racial justice, ideally just pairs. And we'll work on getting that set up in Zoom as well. Thanks so much.
So does everybody understand what they're being asked to do? You're going to be in pairs of 2 people. Let's see here. It's not telling me how many people. How many people do we have in our participants? 19. So we need 10, 9 breakout rooms.
Not telling me, that's so weird.
Yeah. Okay, so let's try this. And 1 to 2%. And then if we have 1 person here, we're going to move you to room 8. Okay.
That's great.
I'm going to mute this for just a minute while we're doing. How much time do we have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Our time is coming to a close, friends. I'm gonna, uh-oh, did I not open rooms? Were you all in one room online? Oh, no. I don't think I opened the rooms.
Oh, no. Do you want to check in with them and see what that was like for them?
Well, let's just stop the share real quick.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, friends. Were you divided into rooms or not?
No,
Did you have a conversation?
no.
No.
Oh, no.
Waiting.
Did you think about what your own faith tradition says about racial justice? I'm
We were
so sorry.
silent. Well,
Yes, yes, we thought
Does
about
one
it.
or two of you want to share real quickly before we get back to it, the larger group?
I could share. The Baha'i faith is
Okay.
based on this. This is one of the fundamental principles. And in fact, Abdul Baha, when he visited the United States, he said, this is the fundamental problem that the United States will have to face.
Amen.
One of one of the pillar of Islam is justice, equality.
For my faith, for UU, we are in the middle of actually trying to pass an eighth principle that says that we are an anti-racist faith. So it's a very core part of our faith community and our faith movement. And we also have taken a stand against racial violence over the years as well.
Thank you, Ronnie. All right, we'll have more opportunities and we'll get the breakouts done for you more clearly. Sorry about that.
And I think we might actually be able to tweak things so that you'll get a chance to have another discussion. So you'll actually get to pair up, those of you who are online, in just a minute. Oh, some of you, let me see if I can, yeah. Some of you will remember, I want to introduce a working definition. Thank you.
You can just let anyone in.
Oh, there it is. Thank you. Yes, I see it now. Some of you will remember a working definition that I've introduced a couple of times in this group. It is, at this point, the dominant definition in sociology spaces and a lot of academic spaces. It's also the definition that many anti-racism activists have been working out of for many years now. And I think I've mentioned before, if you've read Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum, or if you've read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, they both reference this definition. And as of the end of 2020, it is now one of the definitions in Merriam-Webster's dictionary as a result of 40 years, 50 years at this point, of intentional organizing to shift our definition, because very often the definition is that racism equals race prejudice. That's often the definition you see in the media, right? Conflicts between people of different races. The difference with this definition is it's race prejudice plus institutional and systemic power. Now, I want to take a minute. I think we all know what prejudice is: to prejudge, to judge without information, to judge beforehand. I want to take a minute to talk about race, and instead of me talking, let's see if this link will work. Oh, is the audio set up in the share? Great. Oops. Let's try that one more time. That's going to require a shift. I know I couldn't get the image. Thanks.
No worries. Let me just turn off this share.
Yep.
That. Go to that one.
Yep.
Did you know that race was not always considered a biological or genetic category? So how did we come to understand it that way today? We all have a working definition of race, whether
kind of understand it, hate it, claim not to see it, or study it.
and call
That's me. It still plays a role in all of our daily lives. From the way that people interact to the places they live and stereotypes they face, race is still a determining factor in our social structures, both inside and outside of the U.S. But full disclosure, I do a lot of U.S. history, so this
Our video is frozen.
Yeah, we aren't seeing it well.
operate differently across various contexts. Okay, so let's get started by asking, what were some of the earliest definitions of race?
Yeah, it's paused again. That's so strange.
Stop sharing, start over.
Yeah.
Did you know that race was not always considered a biological or genetic category? So how did we come to understand it that way today? We all have a working definition of race, whether you kind of understand it, hate it, claim not to see it, or study it, hint, hint, cough, cough, that's me, it still plays a role in all of our daily lives. From the way that people interact to the places they live and stereotypes they face, race is still a determining factor in our social structures, both inside and outside of the US. But full disclosure, I do a lot of US history, so this is a US specific video about race, since these histories operate differently across various contexts. Okay, so let's get started by asking, what were some of the earliest definitions of race? Well, before we started thinking of race along the lines of biology, genetics, or phenotype, aka physical appearance, did you know that it was largely considered a category of kinship or group affiliation? In the 16th century, we started to see the use of the word race in English, but it isn't attributed to physical traits or behavior. It meant quite literally that you were all members of the same household, group, or shared a common ancestor. But when did race shift to being less about kinship groups to sounding more complicated than the lyrics to I'm My Own Grandpa? Well, we can see that starting in the colonial era. And that brings us to our second question. Why did we see the shift in the idea of race in the 17th and 18th century? The answer to this question is firmly rooted in two things: the rise of global capitalism that was backed by slavery and colonialism, and a period of theorizations in Europe known as the Enlightenment. When the Spanish began the colonization of the Caribbean and later Latin America after 1492, they looked to native populations to mine silver and gold under brutal working conditions. They set about enslaving, attacking, and murdering those who didn't comply. Thousands of native people died as a result of overwork, genocide, or because they were exposed to new diseases brought over with the Spanish settlers. And when England established its first successful long-term colonies in North America in Virginia in 1607, they looked to mirror this pattern of enslavement with native people, while also seeking copious amounts of silver and gold. But they had limited success with this route because, one, Virginia wasn't exactly rich in gold, and two, native populations were able to resist the efforts of early settlers through fighting back or escaping and blending into adjacent native groups. English settlers still wanted to make money off of this venture, so they began to look to alternative ways of making Virginia profitable, and that came in the form of tobacco. But a major problem with growing tobacco is that it requires a ton of labor, and the laborers needed the agricultural skills to turn the crop into cash. Because they had already met with sustained resistance from native populations, English settlers looked to other potential labor sources: enslaved Africans and indentured British laborers. There are some important distinctions to make between these two groups. First, indenture was a contractual agreement with fixed terms that varied widely. Some indentured servants were brought to the colonies against their will, either as a punishment or because they were children. Terms of these contracts were often very exploitative. But many came willingly in exchange for their passage to the new colonies, and many of these indentured servants finished the terms of their contracts and began lives as property owners. Enslavement of Africans was an entirely different category of labor from indenture, because 1, slavery was for life, not for a fixed term or a number of years. 2, slaves were not considered human. 3, it was not a contract because it takes 2 consenting humans to enter into a contract. And 4, slave laws were enacted codifying hereditary slavery, meaning that if you were enslaved and had children, then those children would also remain in slavery. With the expansion of this system, there was understandably some resistance, even from Europeans. So in order to continue to justify slavery, we start to see the pseudoscience of race emerge that connected physical features, behavior, and legal rights right around the 18th century when colonial use of slaves was expanding. Anthropologist Audrey Smedley notes that scientific ideas about physical appearance and racial difference in the 18th century were largely folk ideas used to justify already existent social norms. So as a result of a desire to perpetuate systems of exploitation, more and more distinctions were made about the supposed differences amongst races, primarily the differences of Black people from their white counterparts. This evolution of race became more concretized after social structures of slavery were in place, and not before, and was solidified by the Enlightenment. Which brings us to our third question. How did the Enlightenment impact definitions of race? The Enlightenment was a period of primarily European thought and ideological development that saw the emergence of some key concepts that tie back into today's discussion. First, there was a push in scientific communities to categorize the natural world using reason and creating elaborate hierarchical systems that emphasize the similarities between different species and subgroups and the inherent differences amongst others, and race was fitted into this same mold. As European theorists looked to classify the world into scientific groupings, physical markers that were already established social norms through enslavement and genocide were ways that they sought to prove that this was the natural order and not a social construction. For example, Thomas Jefferson, who was a proponent of concepts like individual liberty and freedom for white men, or those he considered his peers, also made claims that Black slaves required less sleep than their European counterparts to justify excruciatingly long and inhumane work hours. And Samuel Cartwright, who falsely claimed that drapetomania was a mental defect that caused enslaved Black people to run away from slavery, as if wanting to escape a lifetime of enslavement was illogical. The Enlightenment formulation of history also played a crucial role in the development of social ideologies of race. Kant, Hegel, and other philosophers of their day claimed that certain racial groups stood outside of history or had no history, and this included all groups that they considered non-white or outside of European ideals of modernity. This meant that groups that were devoid of history and culture were inherently less valuable and therefore subordinate to other races, and they were cast as the natural sacrifices of progress. These assumptions were also codified into law in the 18th and 19th century. The first naturalization laws of the United States in 1790 limited naturalized citizenship to free white persons and excluded other groups. Children born of enslaved mothers were said to inherit the legal statuses of their mother, effectively keeping them in bondage perpetually. And Native Americans were often denied legal property rights, which helped to expedite the process of westward expansion across the North American continent. And anti-miscegenation laws were drafted in order to assure that people from different racial backgrounds did not intermarry or have children in order to protect ideals of racial purity. But these racial categorizations didn't always neatly align with skin tone. In his book, Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race, historian Matthew Jacobson notes that in the US, white or Caucasian was not always considered a unified race composed of anyone of European descent. Whiteness was often considered exclusive to Anglo-Saxon descendants, while other European groups were broken into different ethnic categories such as Celt, Slavs, Iberics, and Hebrews, which were considered separate races from the 1840s to the early 20th century. But in the 1920s, when there was a stemming of immigration from Europe, these different races were subsumed into one category called whiteness to shore up a cultural majority against other racial groups and immigrants, and this persisted throughout the 20th century. So how does it all add up? up? Well, race started as a marker of kinship, but then we see it shift to become less about familial inheritance and more focused on physical indicators due to the rise of Enlightenment reasoning and labor exploitation. But where does that leave us today? Well, in the past several decades, scholars have noted both an uptick in identifying with your ethnic history, for example, pride in your country or culture of origin, instead of just being white or black. But we've also seen a revival of outdated theories of race being biologically determined and attached to certain traits, like considering all people of one physical type as prone to certain behaviors.
I'll go ahead and take us out of share, I think. I see a hand raised. I don't know.
Reverend Alexandria, did you have something to share?
Oh, I had my hand up. Oh, well, I had my hand up to let you know, to get your attention that we couldn't hear the video at first, but I understood that we were having technical difficulties and it was resolved. I will say that that was an excellent video.
It's a lot of information, isn't it? Like, I've literally written 2 different books just on race, and that video in about 10 minutes captures more than I could across 2 books. I'm a huge fan. What I'd like to ask y'all to do, we're going to do another breakout session, this time one that the folks online will also get to experience. I'd like you to think about 2 things. If you're willing to share, and for some people it's too vulnerable, so you don't have to, but if you're willing to share, where does your family's story show up in the video we just watched? Where did you see yourself or your ancestors in that video? The other question I'd like you to think about is, what role has your faith tradition or faith community played in the history we just watched? And that's a complicated question, because for many of us, our faith tradition has played a role in resisting racial injustice, and our faith traditions have played a role in propping up racial injustice. So that's a complicated question. I'm going to give us 10 minutes. I'm going to give us 7 minutes in pairs to discuss that. So again, the questions are, where did your family or ancestors show up in that history? And the second question is, where does your faith tradition or faith community show up in that history?
Here comes the rooms. Where's Nancy?
All right, and the people who joined later need to be assigned to rooms. So you can move some of the assigns.
So
yeah.
let me just move her to this
Exactly, and then those other 2 can go to room 9. Oh wait, yeah.
Those are me.
Oh, those are you. Oh, perfect.
Well, let's see here. Ronnie hasn't joined. Sue, can you join a room?
Because if not, one shift people around.
Kanatha. Nancy, let me put you in with Greg Kremenliev. There you go. I'm just going to move these to this room in case they're just not around.
Yeah, that makes
Okay.
ton of sense. Oh, sure.
Oh, she shared the seat down. And this is still in the chat room.
Good.
So we just Is this it? No?
Ah, oh, I saw it.
Let's try it again.
It's that one there. Yeah.
Okay. We have to do the same thing over here. And making it.
And I'm not sure that worked the last time.
If I'm
It
doing
keeps
it from
switching it to
here,
pause.
yeah, let's do this then.
Yeah. Yeah, we're just getting things queued up real quick, yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Aha, that did work. Great.
Here we go.
Oh, do you mind if I give it an intro
Yeah.
real quick? Sorry. So, friends, I'm sorry we can't debrief this conversation, but we'll debrief in a little bit. This video is going to take us into, you remember our definition of racism is racism equals race prejudice plus institutional and systemic power. This is going to talk a little bit about how that definition of racism, what he calls structural racism, shows up today. I have a specific task for you as you listen to this one, which is think about what your faith tradition has to say about the examples that show up in this video. And think about the role of I4C in responding to what he brings up here.
Moving the race conversation forward. You've probably noticed that when our news media talks about race, when they talk about racism, when they talk about racial justice issues, they quite often talk about it all wrong. But have you ever tried to quantify exactly how and why the media gets it wrong about race and what we can do to fix it? Well, there's a new paper published by Race Forward entitled Moving the Race Conversation Forward that sets out to do just that by compiling nearly 1,200 articles from major newspapers and cable news outlets and systematically breaking down the most common mistakes we fall into when we talk about race. And in their research, Race Forward identified 7 harmful practices, the 7 most common bad habits in media coverage of race, as well as recommended strategies to get us back on track. And I recommend reading all 7 for yourself, but right now I want to focus on just one of the biggest traps that racial justice conversations fall into, which is our tendency to focus too much on individuals instead of systems. Because when we talk about race, when we talk about racism, when we talk about racial justice, it's important to remember that there are levels to this thing. There are at least 4 different levels of racism that each need to be considered. The first level is internalized racism, which is all the prejudice, bias, and blind spots you might have within yourself as an individual. The next level after that is interpersonal racism, which is what happens when we act out that internalized racism on each other. Those 2 levels, the internalized and the interpersonal, are the 2 individual levels of racism. And those are the simplest ones to focus on, the easiest to recognize in our day-to-day lives, the ones we spend most of our time talking about, but I'm here to tell you, there's something else. Systemic racism. Once you get past those individual levels, first of all, you have to deal with institutional racism. The racist policies and discriminatory practices in schools and workplaces and government agencies that routinely produce unjust outcomes for people of color. And when you step beyond that level, you have structural racism, the unjust, racist patterns and practices that play out across the institutions that make up our society. The individual and systemic levels of racism are both important, both necessary to reckon with, and they're both usually interrelated. But if you want a real, fully clear-sighted conversation on racial justice, you have to be talking about both levels. And one of the most common ways we fail to see the big picture on race is by failing to think about systemic racism, by failing to be systemically aware. In their research, Race Forward found that our media coverage far too often falls into that trap. They found that approximately 2/3 of race-focused media media coverage fails to consider how systemic racism factors into the story. 2/3 of their coverage of race fails to be systemically aware. And that is a problem. When we constantly focus only on individual stories, it distorts our sense of how racism works. It encourages us to see racism only as the product of overt, intentional racist acts by individuals that can be fixed simply by shaming and correcting those individual defects. And it encourages us to see individual stories of transcending racism as proof that there is no more racism. That if we have a black president and Oprah is a billionaire, then there must not be anything else to talk about. And any problems that other people of color still face must be due to deficiencies on their part. It must be a problem with them instead of a problem with the system. And that is no, just no. We cannot have a real thorough conversation about incarceration rates for people of color, about the thousands of families torn apart by our immigration policies, about the perennial disparities in education, housing, healthcare, employment opportunities. We cannot have real talk about any of the biggest issues that affect us all as individuals if we are not also thinking about the systems involved. We cannot have a discourse that brings us closer to racial justice without being systemically aware. So next time you listen to the news or read the news or watch the news or surf the news, you should take a minute to ask yourself, is this coverage systemically aware? And read Race Forward's new research paper entitled Moving Our Race Conversation Forward for more on these issues and for intervention strategies to help us have some real talk about racial justice.
Help me turn it off and then. So as he went through that really frenetic list of things, and yeah, you can just, yeah, actually.
Just let us see each other.
Yeah, I think that's great. You may have noticed some stuff that looked familiar, that sounded familiar. He listed a number of issues that are going on today, some of which I foresee has already taken on, and some of which are definitely a part of life in Contra Costa County. I'm gonna stop sharing because I want to give you just a tiny bit more content, and then shift the conversation just a little bit. Okay, let's see if I can make that work. Did it work?
Which one are you looking at?
I'm looking for, yeah, oh yeah, it did. Okay, that's great, thanks. And slideshow from current slide. Excellent. So we've been talking about this definition of racism. The conversation, as I mentioned, is shifting. Oh, thank you.
Just for the folks at home to be able to see it.
Right. Awesome, thank you. The conversation's shifting a lot. A lot of younger organizers and activists are now actually talking about, when they say racism, they say white supremacy culture. Because as the history video we watched showed us, the history of this country related to race was founded on assumptions of white culture being the dominant, the normative, the superior culture. And so this is a phrase that panics people in my denomination. My denomination has not shifted to talking about white supremacy culture. When I'm doing a 2-day anti-racism training, I usually drop the language in halfway through the second day when they've already been immersed enough to be ready for it. I know that this is weighted language. And Tema Okun and a number of other organizers, including a lot of organizers from Oakland who helped cultivate this definition, really think it's important for us to delve into it. And most of the young anti-racism activists, organizers, and just people who care about racial justice are more and more using this framework as they engage in the work of dismantling all of those issues of racial injustice that Jay Smooth listed at the end of his video. So the definition is, white supremacy culture is the widespread ideology baked into the beliefs, values, norms, and standards of our groups, many if not most of them, our communities, our towns, our states, our nation, teaching us both overtly and covertly that whiteness holds value, that whiteness is value. In the work talking about white supremacy culture, they list 15 different expressions of it, and I want to note that these are expressions all of us are trained into, certainly not just white people, that we are valuable insofar as we follow these unspoken rules in our communities. And not following those rules comes at a cost. So I'm sharing those. You'll get to see them in more depth in just a second. So I'm going to skip over to say, there's a few I've pulled from Tema Okun's website just as illustrations. And the reason I want to share these, again, you'll get to delve into them in a little more depth in just a second. The reason I wanted to share them is you'll notice that each of them has antidotes. This is my favorite part of that work, is saying there's another way of being. There are options for how to change that culture. And so what I'd like to do at this point is share with you a resource that those of you who are online can look at from the link I just posted. And thank you, Will. Everybody who's in the room will get a physical copy. This version that you're looking at right now, you'll notice that they softened the language as well, because this comes to us from a foundation that was borrowing it from a nonprofit. They weren't quite ready, thank you, to talk about white supremacy culture. So they talk about white dominant culture, and then they provide alternatives. What I'd love to do is, let's see if I can do this again. Yep. Is ask you to sit with this document for a second. And look at those values and think about where you have experienced one of those values and its alternative value. How are your experiences of those two things different? Where do you see your faith commitments in the right column? And if you're brave, where do you see your faith community in the left column? Why might that be? What could you do about it? So I want to stay with those top 3 questions for now, because we're going to move into small groups one last time. Keep skimming while we take care of that technical issue.
I'm not seeing the columns.
In the document, in the PDF that's in the chat box?
Oh.
Can you follow that link in the chat box?
Yeah, sorry, I said that really quickly. I posted it, yeah.
There's a link.
Okay.
That if you follow that, you should be able to at least look at it online, possibly print it if need be, but we'll be opening in our other rooms. Tell you what, we'll copy and paste the top 3 lines into the chat room once the rooms have opened too.
Okay.
Seven minutes? Yeah. 7 minutes, folks. Laura, I'm going to put you in with Christine. So,
What was there, one person by themselves up there?
there's
Dennis? Oh, there we go. Eric is there.
people that haven't managed rooms. And we're back, folks. Thank you for getting into your breakout rooms and coming back so quickly.
So friends, welcome back. Isn't this a great resource? I don't know how the conversation was on Zoom. There was a buzz in this room as people were recognizing things and recognizing possibilities and wrestling with concepts. I had a good 15 minutes more. I was hoping we would have some large group discussion around what it means to engage in some of these practices within I4C, what it means for I4C to be introducing some of these practices into the county, whether that's in governmental spaces or cultural spaces or civic spaces or religious spaces. I was hoping we could have a conversation about who we could build bridges with across generations and across movements around some of these cultural commitments. We obviously don't have time for that, but I wanted to, at the very least, say I hope you continue wrestling with those questions. Maybe if you have time in another meeting, you can circle back to some of those and say, what does it mean to look at these values that are increasingly showing up in millennial and Gen Z spaces as givens for how they work together? Some of these values, the alternative values, were absolutely a part of how we founded the Oakland Peace Center, which is the nonprofit that I helped launch a few years back, that shaped our organizational and collaborative culture. There are some of these that you might say, you know, my faith community practices these really well. We have a gift to offer the larger community on that front. There are so many possibilities for what to do with this. I hope, while we are at the end of our time, that this is actually the middle of a conversation and that you continue to build with each other these practices, that you talk about them with your family, with your faith communities, with people across all the generations to see what resonates and what's possible, and how they might help you in your work of dismantling white supremacy culture and systemic racism across this county. Oh, I thought I only had till quarter till. Oh, that's great. Then we've got 7 minutes for what came up for you. If it's all right, I'm going to start in. Thank you. I thought I only had till quarter till. That's great. Well, I've done my closing. Now let's talk. What came up? Let's start with the folks on Zoom. If anybody is willing to share anything that came up for you as you looked over this resource, as you thought about the content from today, what came up in your conversations?
Well, unmute Dennis. Go ahead and unmute Dennis.
There we go. Dennis, did you want to share?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
And then I think Nancy and anybody else who wants to jump in after that.
Okay. Sorry about that. I think, you know, in our faith community, one of the big problems is that, you know, there are different groups within the community, within our own community. And, you know, we've got some people who are very forward thinking and very open on issues of race. And we had a program called Just Faith. And many of the people were involved in that. But at the same time, we've got a larger community that, you know, doesn't even think about these things. And so it's a matter of really educating and kind of bridging the gap between the various factions within the community, and getting people to really see that, you know, this is an issue and this is a problem. And, you know, we have to educate and to try and bridge that gap.
I appreciate you naming that, Dennis, because I think one of the challenges a lot of us face, one of the things that Will and I were talking about in that list was fear of conflict. And you notice that showed up in the left column. And I've certainly worked with a lot of faith communities from a lot of different traditions in my interfaith work that are afraid of addressing complex issues because they want to preserve unity. And you'll notice that was in the left column of this document, because when we don't talk about those things, who benefits from that? The people for whom the system is already working. And so in very subtle ways, that shows up in our longing for unity, even though part of the reason I've been doing interfaith work my whole life is because of that longing for us to be in community together. So thanks for naming that, Dennis. Nancy, I think you were going to jump in.
Yes, Reverend Chandra, I hope this is okay. I was taking the word defensiveness and relating that to a situation in our own family that we're trying to deal with right now. My daughter, as soon as she was of dating age, said she preferred to date Black men, and she did. And so we had a family wedding, and the guy she was having a relationship, 9 years, they expected to be married. They didn't. But at the wedding, there was something happened. Our family down here supported him. My sister just will not let that go. And so in conversations over the years, asking about my daughter, is she dating anybody? And her first question always, is he Black? And finally, I just said, yes, she prefers Black men, but it didn't change anything. So my daughter finally gets married, and guess who doesn't get invited to the wedding? My sister and her family. And so after the wedding, we told my sister about that she's married now, and she married a Ghanaian man who they went to college together, etc. And after many conversations, after many written communications, my sister never apologized. She never said, I said, well, she said, what do I have to apologize for? I had a good friend I worked with who was Black, and we got along great. So unfortunately, it's really at the point where there is no communication. But anyway, that just came up for me and my family, and wanted to put out there.
I really appreciate you sharing that. Some of you know I'm from a mixed race family, and my mother was disowned for marrying my father. And so it's a story that's very alive for me. And it wasn't just that moment, it was the decades of doubling down on that commitment that caused a lot of the pain. And I think that defensiveness shows up not just in the big stuff, it can show up in really small stuff where somebody who has relative power makes a mistake and doesn't have the capacity to say, I screwed up. And that's baked in, that's connected to the culture of perfectionism. It's connected to the culture of what is acceptable, what is right, what is tolerable within a community's rules. So I think that theme of defensiveness, instead of being able to normalize when we've made mistakes and not make it the end of the world, but to create the space for us to learn and grow together and to make it okay to have not gotten everything right. Yeah, thanks. I know we are almost at the end of time.
Any sharing from the
Yeah, I
room?
want to check within the room, yeah.
Come over here so that everyone can hear you.
Thanks.
This is the talking stick.
Thank you, Reverend Chanda. But my question relates to the values you presented, and it is, or I guess it's the comment that each of those values are really beautiful values, and they apply not only to racism, but for just being a good person in general. So it's really reaching out to people who might have a different view, might have a different background, might have a different sexual orientation, whatever, different gender, all of those things, all of those differences, the idea is you just reach out and you appreciate all of them. So this isn't, to me, I struggle with this idea of just focusing on race to the exclusion of all the others out there. I think that just the idea of being a good person in general to everyone, regardless of their race, their gender, their orientation, whatever. And so anyway, I just would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you naming that, because I think in many ways that's true. I think when we do this work well, that it does serve everybody. It serves people across gender and race and culture and orientation, across class. It really does do that work. And I think something that's worth remembering is the reason for those left column values is because they consolidate power, particularly for cis straight white men, at the expense of other people. And that's why they stay in place, even though we know the right column is where we want to live. The left column keeps showing up and keeps reinforcing itself because it does consolidate power. So I think you're absolutely right. And that's how it connects, I think, directly with race. Yeah. And this will be the last one.
I just want to say that I've learned a lot from land acknowledgements, and learning that I am responsible for what has happened in the past. Because of the injustices created my ability to be economically different. And that has taught me so much and opened a whole world of understanding, or at least appreciation, and acknowledging that whatever I could do to help support the indigenous cultures in California is something I would like to, but it was a process to acknowledge that. And I thought that was,
I love that. Yeah, thank you. And that connects back to what Jay Smooth was saying in that video about this is actually why it's important for us to pay attention to not just individualizing things, because they all happen in this broader context, and some of us benefit from and some of us are harmed by those contexts. And I think we are at time. I am so grateful to get to be with you all. I hope that this keeps a conversation alive for y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Shonda. Really appreciate that. Great discussion. We're now privileged to hear from Father Tom Bonacci. I'll get the title right. So appreciate him and look forward to his closing thoughts and benediction, and then we'll be adjourned.
Thank you so much. Tom, it's always fine. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you. These are a short reflection on the Pope Francis's recent visit to Canada to apologize to Indigenous people. And first of all, I would like to frame this that I am grateful for the Pope's energy and concern in this issue. But I would like to critique the apology, because I think that across the board, we can fall into this frame of reference. Let's look back into the past and apologize for crimes that were committed then, without being aware of the implications of those particular crimes in the past, in many ways continue to happen today. And so the apology has to be very, very careful that it doesn't dismiss or neutralize or ignore the ramifications on very, very real people. In the past, systems, traditions were not offended. People were injured, hurt, murdered, killed, and disregarded. In all of our work, we are never talking about a religion. We are never talking about an idea. We are never talking about an exchange of abstractions. Behind every issue, there's a real person. So it's one thing to say, I apologize on behalf of the church for its behavior 100 years ago. But that had real effect on real people. And the families and the survivors continue to live today. Now, many people thought that because Pope Francis is somewhat crippled because of his knee and also debilitated because of his age, that would be a perfect excuse to say that he can't go to Canada. But he did anyway. He went with his illness and with his affliction. And one of the things that I noted in the reports is that he was reading his letter of apology to Indigenous people for the crimes of the church against Indigenous people, at least in Canada, that they could see the pain on his face. And I think that's a very, very important dimension, that the apology or the recognition of what is happening in the world is something that afflicts us and that we can feel in body, mind, and spirit. The Pope recognized the cultural destruction, the forced assimilation. But I think we also have to understand that that forced assimilation and cultural destruction caused the invention of something called residential schools that were fueled with sexual violence, sterilization, and the elimination of people's particular identity. One of the slogans that was actually said was to beat the Indian out of them. That is horrific. And so the apologies we have to be very, very careful with them, that apologies are not antiseptic. They have to say clearly what has happened to very, very real people, and in this particular case, what has happened to children. Here are some of the critiques, and this is meant to be more than a suggestion, but a sense of direction as these apologies are being heard more and more by governmental and church and religious officials through the world. Apology always requires action, but I wonder if the action doesn't have to come first. 2, the apology itself can trigger trauma in the survivors if the action is not forthcoming. 3, the identity of the dead, those who were killed as the result of these policies. The dead must be recognized. What are their names? Who are they? What is their story? We can't simply talk about the generic dead. We're finding in these residential schools and in other facilities mass graveyards of people who have simply been tossed away. Some of the things that did not happen yet that must happen is the doctrine of discovery that the Interfaith Council has spent many sessions exploring, has not been rebuked or revoked by the Catholic Church in particular, or by Christians across the board who participated in the ideology of the doctrine of discovery. Also, the documents in the Vatican, the documents in the library, where the doctrine of discovery is, there are associated doctrines and associated documentation as to what actually happened within the history. Those documents must be revealed to the world, studied by scholars, and become the basis for reconciliation, understanding, and restitution. 3, or lastly, sacred items that have been robbed from Indigenous people to be put into museums must be returned in ceremonies that have been designed by Indigenous people. And I would go so far as to say that in California in particular, those areas that we call mission areas, mission churches, should be returned to Indigenous people, and the future of those particular buildings and land should belong to the people from which it was stolen. So I think the apology is great. I think the fact that the Pope went to Canada and did this is magnificent. But it tells us it opens a door, and a door that I don't believe will be shut, because I really believe that is, with the example of Pope Francis, that he has set the example that this is the beginning and a major first step. So thank you for allowing me to share that with you. Should I continue with the final benediction?
Please.
So let us remember that we are in the presence of one another, and that's a sacred and wonderful place to be. We should never presume the presence one of another. In the midst of conflict and division in the world, you, O beloved God of 1,000 names, bring us together in this gathering. You bring us together so that we as a council, as a community of communities, and as individuals may honor the dignity of all people, might bless the children, might support women who need to be free in body, mind, spirit, and soul. You bring us together that we may celebrate love in all its varied ways. You bring us together that we might honor nature, the resources of the earth, that we might respect the resources with a spirit of generosity and kindness. You bring us together that we may work for the freedom of all people to be their best selves, to avoid cynicism, sarcasm, and resentment, that even when our hearts are broken, may they be open to the creativity that you bless us with. Finally, O God of 1,000 names, O divine that no one tradition can capture, but all of us together can sense, may we be people of gratitude for this gathering who now releases all the love in their hearts to the peoples of the world, to the beings of the universe. Amen.
And amen. Have
Amen.
a blessed week, friends. Be well. Here's some closing announcements on our way out. The recording will get up later this afternoon. Thank you, Father Tom, for the benediction.
Thank you
And
for
a
this
reminder-
wonderful meeting.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
thanks
you.
to everyone. Praying for peace with our Sikh siblings, as well as at the International Day of Peace, learning how to help those that are facing suicidal ideation. And our Meaningful Monday program is next Monday because of Labor Day, and we'll look at chapter 6 and 7 of Holy Envy. We have a fabulous program on September 21st with Dr. Maha Hilal on Is Peace Possible? Reckoning with U.S. State Violence. She is quite a published scholar, and she'll be in conversation with our friend Fresh Left White on the intersectionalities of all of those pieces of peace. And then, of course, Father Tom is leading our October 2nd retreat, and registration is online. The annual meeting Sunday, October 23rd from 6 to 8:30, and our winter interfaith dinner and program now at Mount Diablo UU Church on November 6th.